Welcome everybody to the CG Pro podcast. Here today we have Chris Nichols. I'm going to introduce him in a second, but first of all, just to say we are CG Pro and we're a school. If you want to find out more about what we do, follow us at becomecgpro.com. So yeah, it gives me great pleasure today to welcome Chris. Chris had an amazing career, an amazing background in the CG industry. He is director of the Chaos Group Labs and has been a CG artist going back a long way and worked at some incredible studios like Digital Domain on really world-class visual effects. Just yeah, really amazing depth of skills across the CG spectrum, and background in visual effects and architecture, and a real passion for innovation. I think that's why he's ended up in the position he's in. But yeah, Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Yeah, so I'd love to start this off just by asking you a little bit about the beginning of your journey into visual effects, how it began, if you had any kind of early inspirations that from film or anything like that kind of led you into wanting to pursue computer graphics.
It's interesting. It wasn't a film, and I didn't really know if I was going to get into visual effects or filmmaking of that nature. But I did become very interested in computers for a very young age, and I was doing when I went to, and I always thought I was going to be an architect, right? So as I started to go into to study architecture, or I didn't want to study architecture right away. I decided I wanted to get a degree in something different and sort of do a master's of architecture. But as I started doing that, I decided I was going to study mathematics and I was going to study art in undergraduate. And as I got into math, I got introduced to this amazing computer called Next Computer. I don't know if you remember those Next computers that
Yeah.
Steve Jobs did after he got fired from Apple. He started this Next Computer thing. And it was pretty amazing because it had this program called Mathematica. And I was really getting into visualization in mathematics. And I like really understanding things. And I started looking at developing a system with Mathematica to visualize four-dimensional spaces. And
Wow.
It was kind of an interesting exercise. And I got into the idea of seeing things that aren't there yet or whatever, visualization. And I started realizing in architecture, that's a cool thing, visualizing architecture. So when I ended up going to architecture school, I started learning visualization stuff. And I went to Rice University and they had these they had a lab there called the RAVEL, which was the Rice Advanced Visualization Lab, and they just bought these SGIs for an architecture school. Think about that, right? And then
Yeah.
no one knew what to do with them because they're like, what do we do with this thing? And they had wavefront on them, right? And I was like, and so I was the only one that like no architect was going to start learning wavefront. It just wasn't going to happen. So, but I started learning wavefront and I started getting interested in that. And I was like, there's no use for this in architecture, but I'm fascinated by it. And then of course I found out, Jurassic Park was done with wavefront and Alias and stuff like that. So I got really into that and sort of understanding, well, if I really want to get into this stuff, I need to understand how things are done in visual effects. And so I got kind of into it, but I also got into visualization for architecture. And I ended up working at a big architecture company called Gensler. So it's actually the largest architecture company in the world. And I really got into it quite a bit. And so I worked there for about 5 years and it was going pretty well. But at that point, I started to, there was something happening, and it's around 2001 or so, 2002. It was just at the end of my career there. There was a big problem being solved in architecture, which was how do you visualize light correctly? Because at that point, everyone was still using rasterized rendering solutions. and there wasn't a good way to look at light correctly. And so I looked at it and I said, well, there's got to be better ways of doing this. And so I really started investigating ray tracing, and more specifically, global illumination. And I really got into that. And right at that time, there was a sort of a battle of ray tracers happening, and there was three big new ones that were all plugins for 3ds Max, which is a lot of people were using. And there was one called Final Render. It was done by a company out of Germany called CBOS. There was another one called Brazil, which was done by a company called Splutterfish. There was a couple of guys that start from Blur. And then there was another one called VRay, written by this guy Vlado, who
Never
had,
heard of it.
he had put it up as a free beta for people to test out on a Delphi forum, right? And I started to look at that, and I was like, oh my God, this is like, and they're all kind of doing similar things, but the VRay one was the simplest one for me. Like it was the fastest at actually giving you a global illumination problem. And global illumination was a huge problem that needed to be solved in architecture, right? Because it's like the light in this room. I mean, that's all through global illumination, right? There's just through the windows and everything that's happening. So it was a real big problem. And I was like, this is brilliant, because before we had to hack everything, right, to make it look right. And so that was sort of the thing that got me into like ray tracing, and I really got passionate about it. And it was kind of cool. And then not along around that time, I got an email from a friend of mine called Eric Hansen. I don't know if you know Eric or not.
Oh yeah, Eric.
So he said, "Hey, you know what? I'm back at Digital Domain, and we're about to start on this really big movie, and we need people who can do buildings, because we have to build like all of New York for this movie called Day After Tomorrow." So I was like, "Oh, well, that sounds interesting." And so I sort of debated whether I want to stay with architecture or not. And it was, I think the thing that really got to me was I had a really great sort of vice president for my department. And she was, I said, I really, I'm an architect. I want to be a designer. I don't want to be the guy who just knows how to do CG. She goes, listen, Chris, we can find designers. At this point, we can't find people like you. And so you're really good at the computers. I was like, but I'll give you a chance to do some design projects. And I was like, okay. So they put me on a design team, and it was to do some interior office. And they started going through all the requirements of the fire ratings on the doors and the handicap rails. And I was like, oh wait, no, I don't care about this. I like making the pictures. And so that's, I think, the thing that sort of like led me to believe is like, well, I think I'm gonna go into the movies, because then I can still make buildings, but I don't have to care if they fall down or not, because they're sort of movies, right? So I think that's what kind of
make them fall down on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that's how I got into visual effects.
Amazing. Yeah, it's a really interesting, especially in some of the earlier days of VFX, how people got into it, because they were basically kind of like where we are now. People then were trying to figure out how offline rendering worked, and they had to bring people from all these different specialisms together to work it out. So it must have been really an exciting time.
It was, but it was also very strange to me, because, I just sort of came from the architecture world where we were solving major global illumination problems, right? And then I went back to visual effects, where I assumed everything was going to be super high-end visual effects. And they're like, ray tracing is way too expensive. You have to fake everything with rasterized rendering and RenderMan. And I'm like, we have this great thing called ambient occlusion. I said, that's not real. That's not real GI. And I got really upset about it. And I used to fight them on it all the time. I was probably the biggest asshole. I was like, you got to ray trace everything. And, it was really funny. They just did not like the idea of ray tracing back then. But I think eventually, after a while, it was just, it just didn't make any sense anymore. Even though ray tracing was slower, it was the huge amount of work that you had to do to make things look better with rasterized rendering, right? So it was like you had an army of shader writers and technical directors to support all the hacks that you had to do to make the thing look real. You could always make it look real. You just had a huge army of stuff that was going on there. And so it was kind of, it was interesting. And then when eventually around, 2006 to 2009, they started changing the way that visual effects were being done, and they started using a lot more pure ray tracers. I mean, obviously people were using mental ray for a while, but they started using VRay more often and a few other solutions and Arnold. Then you didn't need the army of TDs anymore, right? It became much, much simpler. So it was kind of interesting. So for sure.
It was cars, right? In RenderMan, that was when ray tracing started to be introduced in RenderMan.
Yes,
Around
when they were
the time,
bragging
maybe.
about the fact that it took 36 hours of frames to render some of
Yeah,
those.
yeah.
Yeah,
At
yeah.
what point? So you were at DD when they switched from RenderMan to VRay?
I wasn't no well, it's interesting. I was at DD for a couple of stints, right? So I went to Day After Tomorrow for their after tomorrow, and then after that I moved on to iRobot, which was also a lot of fun. And then I went on to this fabulous movie called Stealth that no one saw. It's actually not that good. It's up there with the movies that you don't really want to mention too much, but it was a really, really tough problem on Stealth because they were doing a lot of hacks to make these planes look real, and so it was one of those things that was going on there. But and then after a while, a lot of people sort of move on and by different positions, and so I was offered a job at Sony, and a lot of people were working at Sony at the time, and I went to go work on Ghost Rider there,
Cool.
and that was the last show that Sony used burps on, which was kind of an interesting thing. So talking about old school lighting tools. Uh, and so that was something interesting. And then I didn't really know what I wanted to do because Sony was huge at that point. There was over 1,000 people working there on Sony movies. It was one of the biggest times that Sony was. And my supervisor was a guy named Kevin Mack. I don't know if you know Kevin, but he's a
Yeah, I know
wonderful
Kevin.
person.
Yeah, he's cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's awesome. Yeah.
he's a wonderful person. And I told Kevin, I was like, hey, can I invite you out to lunch? I want some career advice. And it was interesting because he and I both worked at Sony, which is this big thing. And in order to, at a big company like Sony, in order to progress, you sort of have to make the steps of like, you're a lead, now you're a CG supervisor, now you're this, and it could take years for you to sort of make those jumps, and you sort of have to wait your turn, right? And so I said, I'm interested. It's like I would like to sort of think of what it would take for me to become a VFX supervisor. What are the steps I need to take? What are the leadership skills, whatever? And he said, you know what I would do, Chris? And you didn't hear this from me, but I would leave Sony. So that he basically said, go work for a small shop somewhere, like maybe even do commercial work for a little bit, and just jump right into some of those places will hire you as a CG supervisor or as a VFX supervisor, depending on your skill set and what you do and what you're bringing to the table. Or you can get there much quicker, and then you will learn a lot faster because you'll be put into these situations. So that's exactly what I did. And I ended up going to work. Well, first I went for a short amount of time. I went to a company called SpeedShape. And then not long after that, I went to as a VFX supervisor over at a company called Sway, which did some really, really awesome car commercials. This is during the height of car commercials, when they were, people would actually spend like $1 million on a car commercial or more, right? And
Yeah.
one of the advantages we had at Sway was, well, first of all, we made our cars look good because we had really good guys on the lighting side and on the shading side of things. So it was really cool. But the other big advantage that Sway had, it had a car simulator called Drivatron. It was written by a guy named Graham Fife.
Great name.
Yeah, the Drivatron was incredible. It was such a cool thing, and you basically had a steering wheel and you did everything. But it had this. I mean, it would squish the tires when you would go in different directions depending on the air on the tires. It would leave red and green marks on the the road for tire screeches when he would lose traction. It just did absolutely. And Graham developed an anti-lock brake system, an anti four-wheel drive system, or an all-wheel drive system. It was just amazing, and it would look so good that it was kind of an incredible situation. And I remember one of the things. This is a great story about it. I'm just real quick. One of our executive producers, she was really excited about it, but she came from the live action world. So she invited this professional stunt driver who was retired, to come by and suggest, hey, why don't you come by and, you can be the official driver of the Drivatron and do all these cool stuff, because you literally could just do anything and it looked perfect. He took one look at it, and he says, can I see you outside? And he saw her, and then he walked away. And I was like, what happened? And she said, oh, I didn't even realize it. No one wants to work. Like, he said, if I work for you guys, I'm going to take so many jobs away from my friends, because there's no risk in driving a simulator, and they get paid by like all these things, right? We were taking Ford F-150 and jumping it over these huge ramps. You hit the roll button and it crashes. You just hit the reset button and do it over again, right? So like that was terrible. So he's like, nope, can't do it for you guys. So it was kind of funny. So
that's cool.
Yeah, so that was after Sway. I went to Method for a little bit. That was kind of fun. They were doing a commercial work there, and I was doing a bunch of, again, car commercials. I did some really fun work for Scion. And then I got a call from some guys at DD again saying, hey, we really want you to come by and work on, I'm going to say, another car commercial called Tron. So
big car commercial, very long.
Car commercial. Yeah. Well, I did, and so I ended up becoming the leads on the light bike sequence, which is basically a 9-minute car commercial, and it was awesome. It was a lot of fun, and I loved working with Joe Kaczynski. He was very, very smart guy, also an ex-architect.
Right.
And he was an architect right around the same, or he was going through architecture school around the same time as I was. So I remember very specifically, he and I were really into CG. He was over at Columbia and I was over at Rice, and I would post some CG stuff and he'd post some CG stuff, but his career obviously took off quite well. And in fact, I'm very excited to see the new Top Gun film that's coming out. I just realized he's got a new film. Cool. Yeah, he's got a new film that just came out. It's coming out on Netflix called Spider something that looks amazing. Spider Pig. Is that what it is? Spider Pig?
No, I was joking. Yeah,
it's Spider something, but it looks really cool. Yeah. And it's got amazing architecture, of course, because it's Joe. And so that was fun working on Tron with him. And I ended up following that up with, I did Girl with a Dragon Tattoo for a little bit. And then I did Oblivion, which was a lot of fun.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after Oblivion, I forgot, I did worked on 47 Ronin for a little bit. And then I worked on Maleficent. And that was my last show I did. Was Maleficent. So. Right. It was a while ago. Yeah.
So that was the point where you jumped across to Chaos Group.
I did. Yeah. The reason, it was interesting. It was around that time, this was, I call it one of the dark times in the visual effects world, and it's, no one's fault. I call it the life of Pi days, right? When things were not necessarily like, but then all these visual effects companies were sort of desperate to try to stay alive, and the studios around the world were pretty much telling them the only way that they would ever get work is if they moved to Vancouver. So, now I just didn't want to do it. My wife had a good career here, and I'm not going to force her and my kids to move to Vancouver. And I knew that I wouldn't necessarily continue growing if I stayed in LA. So I didn't want to do it. It was kind of like, so I didn't know what to do. But like I said, I've been friends with Vlado and Peter, who are the founders of Chaos for forever. since the beginning.
Yeah.
In fact, I was told, I didn't realize it. I was told a couple of years ago that I probably bought the first license of VRay that ever was bought
Wow.
at Gensler.
But
So,
you'd used it in the demo before that, right? You were saying it was like
well, yeah. But
a
when it
trial.
became an actual product,
Yeah.
then they said, "Oh yeah, we want to buy it." And I was at Gensler. I said, "Let's buy it because this is great." And they use it. Gensler obviously still a customer to this day. And so, but anyway, so Vlado and Peter were talking to me about what's going on, and my friend Lon, who had started at Chaos while I was still working on Oblivion, or maybe it was Maleficent, I don't remember, but he had started working at Chaos, and he opened up the LA office. It was just him for a little bit, but he came up to me at some point, and it was VRay's 10th anniversary, which by the way was 10 years ago because this year is VRay's 20th anniversary.
Wow. Happy
So
birthday.
thank you. Well, I'll say that to Vlado.
Pass it on. Yeah.
But he said they wanted to do this special thing for Vlado and Peter to congratulate them on 10 years of VRay. And so we came up with an idea to do this video called VRay IRL, which is where a bunch of us who've been longtime VRay users in the industry, we made this complete spoof video where we decided to rob a bank while talking about all the great features of VRay, and that video kind of went crazy on the internet. It actually became pretty interesting. It was
I haven't
directed
seen
by.
it. Please share a link.
Oh, you
So
got to see it.
we can blast it.
It's really goofy. It starts off looking really terrible, like, oh, this is embarrassing, and then it escalates and escalates. We had car crashes and car chases, and there's blood and violence, and it's pretty ridiculous. And it was all directed by Dan Thrawn. I don't know if you know Dan, but it was
cool.
pretty hilarious. So yeah, so we did that, and I sort of was like, this is kind of fun. I like the creativity of this project. So it was a lot of fun. So anyway, they said, hey, we want to be able to do some interesting things at Chaos. And so they decided to open up this thing called Chaos Labs or Chaos Group Labs. Now it's just Chaos Labs. But and basically the idea was, I'd been working in the industry for a long time, and I knew a lot of different people. I could sort of have my pulse on what's going on and sort of look at what's happening in the industry, and sort of suggest some interesting creative projects that we could work on that would test some new software or put some ideas out there, figure out, different relationships with different customers, and kind of the idea of like, just like a lab, really, like, hey, at least they want to try some new ideas. So that's when the whole idea happened. And I sort of moved over to Chaos, and we officially got an office in Culver City, and there you go. So that's how it all started. And that was about almost 8.5 years ago. So
fantastic. Another must have been again a really exciting time to get to build that from scratch.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, one of the things that I really sort of loved was it was interesting. Like one of the first projects, and I still love this project. One of the first projects that I enjoyed was the Construct project, and it was sort of centered around virtual production. Or didn't actually start being centered around virtual production, but the idea was Kevin Margot, who's the director and creator of Construct, he wanted some help on creating his short, right? And he was a VFX supervisor over at Blur, and he said, hey, I want to do this short, and I'd love to work with Chaos and maybe do some rendering. So I said, okay, well, why don't we try some new stuff? And back then Chaos had been developed their GPU render since about 2008, but GPUs were never powerful enough to sort of, or more specifically, didn't ever have enough memory to sort of really create big final frame renders. You'd always run out of memory on the GPUs. So, but around 2013 or so, when we were working on Construct, NVIDIA just released the K6000s, which had 12 gigs of video memory, which by then was like huge. Like the biggest you ever got before was like 6 or something like that. So we said this may be enough RAM to do final frame stuff, and so we said, okay, so we said, Kevin, why don't we try doing your whole short on the GPU? And NVIDIA, of course, wants to sell GPUs. So they said, we will totally support you on this, right? And
I
so
bet. Yeah.
and that was great because they saw a new market for GPUs, right? Not just games anymore or whatever. I'm not kidding you, they sent us $50,000 worth of GPUs in like this big box of
Wow.
GPUs, which arrived at the office. And then Box Computers also decided to come on board, and we put them into these machines. We just sort of made all these machines and we gave them to Kevin and said, let's see what we can do. And so he started working on a short, and he started realizing with these, at the time, like very, very fast GPUs, that the rendering was so fast that he was getting a result in like, less than a second that was kind of visible. It was grainy, but it's visible. And so he said, I'm I'm doing all the mocap for this short. What if we could get VRay inside of Motion Builder? Right.
Mm.
And that was kind of like this weird problem that we were coming up. And this wasn't the initial thought, but it was Kevin's idea. And I was like, well, this is an interesting thing. And at the time, this is the perfect labs project for me. At the time, we were starting to develop this new thing called App SDK, and which we still have around. But the idea of App SDK is it puts VRay inside of a black box, which allows you to connect to it very easily through any language. You want to do it with Java or C++ or Python or whatever you want, and you can connect to it really easily from other applications. And we said, well, could we use App SDK and, as an example, make it work inside of Motion Builder, which that just didn't seem possible to do. Well, it was like, well, this is a perfect thing to test out, right? And so I said, yeah, so let's. So we did that, and it worked, and we actually were able to fully ray trace Construct while inside of Motion Builder, and we're like, hold on. This changes everything. And it was the thing that we were like, because motion, well, you've worked in Motion Builder, Ed, so it never really looks exactly the way it's going to look on the movie, right?
Not
It's
really.
going to
No.
look
Yeah.
right, but it's going to give you some kind of representation, but it's not, it's just like, but once we started ray tracing it with the same shaders that we were going to use for final frame and the same lighting that we were going to use for the final frame, I mean, it looked grainy, but you got the idea, right? And then we had this mode where we called it the Polaroid mode, where you frame it kind of like I stand in this way and I hit the click button, which is the Polaroid mode, where it would just freeze everything and it would resolve over a couple of seconds. And then you would not see the grain anymore. And that would be something like, you could set the lighting a little better that way, but you would do it while motion capturing, which was kind of awesome.
Right.
So that's when we started. That began my very long passion for bringing ray tracing to virtual production, which I've been doing from the beginning at this point.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about that, because I think the sort of maybe slightly better known version of the journey, going through Avatar, where they were using Motion Builder, and then progressing into Jungle Book, where we started using Unity, but puppeteering it from Motion Builder and then rendering it in Photon, which was kind of strapped to the side of Unity, and then evolving it from there. But yeah, really, really amazing to see where it's going, and I've definitely been a part of that journey myself. But seeing where we've got to now, where the things that you were talking about earlier on, the challenges of making ray tracing feasible offline, basically, like if people saying it was going to take too long, even when you had hours to sit around for one frame, they're still saying it taking too long. But now it's starting to come into real time, into being able to actually rate. I know we're still in the sort of hybrid sense, in general, and things like Unreal, but it's now starting to become available, at least in bits of frames, in real time for actual production and even for actual filming. Yeah.
For sure. And that's been sort of the thing that I've been interested in, right? So what what real time means to me is the experience of it and not necessarily just the rendering part of things, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of the thing that's been amazing. And obviously, like you said, like a lot of things that have evolved since then is that, 10 years, 8 years ago, whatever it was, I mean, people weren't using game engines to do virtual production, right?
No.
And so now that's been the big change, and it's such a huge upgrade from what was possible in Motion Builder in some ways, because there's so much you can do inside of a game engine, right? Game engines are literally built to make a real-time experience of a virtual environment.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what games are,
That's what
right?
they're for. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of the thing that it is. And I've always sort of loved the real-time experience because, especially when we were doing things, for example, on Construct, is you make decisions at the moment, right? You make decisions. Oh no, I want the lighting to look like this, and then you sort of empower the filmmakers to do what they have to do, because before then they sort of like, I don't know, I'm looking at this Motion Builder grayscale something, and I just hope that it's going to look good after it comes out the other end in 9 months, right? And so
Yeah.
now that know that they can actually see the lighting, they can actually see camera lenses, they can see the different things. So that's a really cool experience. But in my mind, uh, the we're still at that same problem that I had when I first came into DD. Like, we don't do real good global illumination with rasterized rendering. You can't, right?
Yeah.
You don't, and you don't do. Now you can, and what makes rasterized rendering look great, just like you could back in 2002, but you just have to work a lot more to make sure you can do that, right? And then you have to optimize your scene for the amount of polygons that it needs, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. So there was always these problems that you had to solve, that were taking away from your creative decision making, right? And I think that's what happened when people started, on the offline side of things, when people started ray tracing, it became better to do it that way. So to ray trace, because then you didn't have to make those compromises. So I believe that now is the beginning of that moment again, where for the real-time world. And so what game engines are bringing to virtual production is an incredible experience, right? Because you're assembling all of these things, and you're able to perform this capture, and you can see so much better of what it is. But there's that, what I'm interested in is that missing gap of the real-time ray tracing inside of that process. So to introduce that, and I think what's important about it is then, what happens is that you can do all of your look dev and your asset building and stuff with the ray tracing solution. Bring that, this, which is what I'm working on now. So, basically, if you use VRay throughout the whole process, including the virtual production thing, this is basically what I'll tell you my pipeline.
Great.
Right. So you start with your asset building, and then you bring in all of your assets, and you do everything you're supposed to do. And then you do it all with VRay. You're looking in VRay, and then we have a new real-time ray tracing solution called Vantage, which Chaos has. And Vantage takes advantage of the RT cores and is super, super, super fast, right, as a ray tracer. Now, what it does in order to be super, super, super fast is that it doesn't include all the features that you would have with a full ray tracer, like subsurface scattering, certain hair shaders, things of that nature, right? But it does everything else really fast, and it'll look really good. So you can use, but you can still use VRay shaders to make it work, because it just reads the VRay shaders as any other shader. Then you can take that all your assets, your environments, everything else, you can bring them inside of Unreal using VRay for Unreal. What VRay for Unreal does is it imports all of the data, brings in the lights, the geometry, and for the shaders, it'll sort of make an equivalent shader in Unreal for visual representation in Unreal, but it'll also maintain all the VRay shaders. And then what's cool is that then what you can do is when you do your motion capture, you can do a live link back to Vantage. So you can do a full ray trace of your scene while you're motion capturing in Unreal. And then the thing is, okay, well then I've done that. And then the other thing you can do is, okay, now that I've got all my performance capture or whatever I can do, now I can still go full ray traced offline to get all the features or the quality levels or anything else I want. I can just keep going and still use the same render. So the render stays consistent throughout it. Because right now, if you don't do that, you have to build it twice. You have to build it for Unreal and you have to build it for VRay or for RenderMan or Arnold or whatever it is. And then you sort of segment it. And I, I keep jokingly, it's like I graduated from rasterized rendering in 2006. I never want to render a shadow map again. So it was just something I sort of said to myself. So I think that if you do a full ray trace, that's the way it's gonna work, and that's what I'm excited to have happen. So that's what I've been working on. I've been working with I think some of you guys know really well, Sally Slade, and
Yep.
they've been working over at Voltaku, and I'm sort of helping them out with some of the cool technology that they're trying to do. So I've been working on this project called Killtopia with them, and sort of basically kicking the tires on this kind of technology and seeing what we can do. And so it's really nice to see how far we've gotten, honestly speaking, because a lot has happened. Let's just put it in the technology side of things, both in software and hardware, since Construct. Because I was joking with Vlado. So remember, we did this thing on Construct, for example. We wanted to see how good an image we could get if we threw a crap of ton of GPUs on the system. So we've made this version of VRay for Motion Builder that ran on 4 VCAs. I don't know if you remember what a VCA is.
Okay.
But VCA had 8 GPUs in it, right? So running on 4 VCAs, we ran 32 GPUs to see how good an image we can get with 32 GPUs rendering this image. And so at a resolution of 960, and it was around 2014, I believe, and resolution of 960 by 540, we were getting a manageable grain. Like it was still grainy, but you could definitely see the image clearly at about 20 frames a second or so, right? Okay. And I've been doing it now, and here's an example, right? This is a laptop with an A5000 in it, right? GPU. And I can get this laptop to do the same construct scene, and it looks pretty darn clean at 45 frames a second.
Right.
So it's a
big,
not 32
graphics cards. Yeah.
Not 32 graphics cards, a laptop. And that's a testimony both of, the RTX stuff that's going on, as well as obviously VRay's now acceleration process and NVIDIA drivers. And so a lot's happened now. So I was like, forget it. We can do this. It's now, right? I can go on set on a laptop and do ray traced images live while capturing in Unreal. It's the time to do it, right? So I really feel that this is kind of a cool thing to do.
I totally agree. Yeah, it allows you to be able to not only see what you're as close to the final result as you possibly can to make all those creative decisions, but also brings people together into such a new way where the world of visual effects and filmmaking were completely separate before. The thing I love about this is it's now bringing all those people together. You can actually play in real time and actually talk to each other and stuff like that. It's very cool.
For sure. I mean, I was a lighter, a lot of, most of my career in visual effects, I was sort of focused on lighting in a lot of ways for obvious reasons. But, even when I was, a junior lighter, I had to guess what a filmmaker wanted to make it look like, right? I was not qualified to be a DP, but yet I was making decisions that the DP should be making, right? And I'm a good lighter, but the vision of how a CG element should be lit should be made by a DP, not by a CG lighter, right? And so that's I'm saying that as someone who did that for a living, but I think that the DP, if you suddenly give them the power to actually do lighting, it could make it look a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely what I saw on being on the Lion King and
Yep.
watching Caleb working with Sam together. You know, he was on the CG from the CG lighting side, very, very, very talented lighter. Caleb,
Hmm.
obviously, an incredible career as a filmmaker, and them
Hmm.
coming together to work out how that relationship works. But the strength in the partnership there, because it's bringing all of Caleb's experience from filmmaking and allowing him to actually light, even though at that point it was in Unity. And we had a very, very rough approximation of real of dynamic GI, kind of faked GI. It was just enough though to really understand, like, at least the major decisions that you wanted to make. Maybe not some of the nuances, but now the evolution is getting towards the nuances as well, and being able to
Yeah.
really, really see it. It's super cool. But to your point,
Yeah.
definitely great to have that knowledge and experience come from there.
I think it's what I think is cool about it, Ed, is you know, visual effects people are so used to the concept of a pipeline, right? Where things
Yeah,
just go down and then you pass the buck down, right? So that's the sort of standard waterfall approach that people do. And I think that waterfalls are easy as a someone who's doing your task, because then you get something and you give something, right? And then if you don't get it, then you're not going to give it, and you sort of sit there and wait, which is what a lot of lighters do when they're waiting for an animation update or trying to give a comp update, or whatever it is, right? And it's just it's a very slow process, but it generally it works. So but now with things like game engines, or even things like omniverse, which I also think is very interesting,
mm,
um, and um, and Houdini as well with Solaris, right? It has really embraced
yeah,
sort of the USD process. It's scene assembly is a much more collaborative thing where everyone gets to work on everything at the same time. And then so we all see the repercussions of our decisions live on set or whatever we're doing. And so that allows you to uh, I think what's cool about it is it allows you to experiment more because you can see the results quickly, right? I was like, oh,
yeah,
did that work? Nope, that's not going to work. Okay, but you'll try it, right?
yeah,
I think that's the kind of the cool thing, um, and also, back to the idea of the quality of real time. Real time is cool because you make your decision when your mouse finger goes up, right? As
yeah.
opposed to keep trying and trying and trying. It's a much more smooth, like you can keep going and going and finding exactly where you want to go. That's where I want it, right? And then you let go. And that's much faster than sort of here's version 295, which we've been there
For sure.
for that to happen. So yeah.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up the USD and on the way there in Omniverse, because I think the idea of trying to bring everybody together in a human sense and a creative sense, and what you're describing is the essentially bringing concepts of engineering into creative process, being able to iterate quicker and see the result quicker. So you can have more experiments, you can fail earlier and see what happens and
Yeah.
base your decision on that, not get locked into it in pre-production and have to stay with that all the way through the movie. You
Yeah.
can work much more you can iterate much more quickly, and I think
Hmm.
it's really exciting to see all the people coming together, and also the tech is really responsible for a lot of that. It's so the advent of USD and Omniverse being able to bring not just people together, but also software platforms together to work in real time. And well, yeah, what are your thoughts on some of that? Because I know that like every place has its own scene format traditionally. Maya has its and VRay has its own scene format, and then Houdini has its own, and now we're seeing more connective tissue being developed.
Yeah, I think I love um I, everyone had to have their own scene format by
Yeah,
choice, right? Like there was no other solution, right? And there in terms of a quote unquote universal format, I mean, we've been stuck with FBX for way too long, and no one really, I don't know if people know where FBX comes from, but it stands for Film Box, is where the
yeah,
FBX format came from, which is actually the company that made Motion Builder. So that was the only way to have, like, we have to have some way of bringing in data into Motion Builder, and they made this format called FBX, but it hasn't evolved in 20 plus years. And it didn't have all these things. So that, obviously there was a Limbic cache that brought in, and that was one thing, et cetera. But it wasn't sort of this universal scene description, which is what USD is. So yeah, we very much became interested in that. I'm fascinated by the process, because what's USD file is not just a way to import and export data. It's a live file that, as the file changes, omniverse changes omniverse on the go, right? And same with Solaris. So it's kind of like this great great thing that's out there that's cool. So I totally love what USD is doing. There's some politics, shall we say, of putting code into that format, which hopefully we can resolve,
Yeah.
and we can get over it. I think obviously now the Academy has a specific branch of the Academy that's going to make sure that everyone's playing nice, which hopefully will continue to do that. And then, but we succeeded with EXR. If we can do what we did with EXR and make that work for USD, then I'm super excited. Then the next big question is, what happens with OSL and Material X, and
I was going
if
to
we
say,
can
yeah.
if we can get those to work nicely with everyone, then we'll be in good shape, right? So, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and lights, I guess, the idea of and they're very simple, essentially, just points with a few numbers attached to them in a way.
Right.
But yeah, because
There are different I mean, we have special flavors of lights, right? And
yeah,
or special kinds of let's just like sky models. There are like 16 different sky models out there, right? Or so the way that you do a dome light or whatever. Yeah. So all of that is, yeah, you're right. It's tricky, but everyone's like, no, you have to do this one universal shader. Yeah, and maybe that does take care of 95% of it, but there could be other cases where we could do something cool with it. So we'll see.
is there are you guys experimenting then with USD in the VRay pipeline?
Oh no, VRay supports USD now.
Right.
So yeah, VRay, we've actually, it was interesting. It came a lot from, there was a huge demand from a lot of our visual effects customers, obviously, to look at Houdini. We've been seeing a huge amount of customers that are moving into the Houdini world these days.
Yeah.
They're looking at it specifically because of what is going on in Solaris. For a lot of our customers, it's a great solution for scene building. So in order to work in Solaris, you got to work in USD. So we really sort of had our heads down in that. And so we support USD for sure in Houdini. And we've got a lot of support of USD also in VRay for Maya, which is great. So we can sort of make this work, right? A lot of it depends on the DCCs, like how well the DCCs themselves support it. But that's where it is. But you mentioned, there's a lot of similarities, by the way, between the USD file format and the VRay scene file. So technically speaking, it may not be impossible for USD files just to be rendered directly out of VRay if we wanted to. So that's something that would be kind of an interesting thing as well. So yeah,
cool.
we definitely know the importance of USD, and we're very excited about where that is. And also Houdini obviously has been it's doing some very cool stuff. So we want to make sure that we support that as well. But as you know, in Solaris, the way that the viewport works is it actually uses Hydra, which is the render, or the viewport manager that's part of the same Pixar open source program, and that's what's directly rendering things. So because we basically had to support Hydra for rendering, we have a Hydra delegate of VRay. So technically speaking, anyone else that uses a Hydra delegate for rendering, we should be able to adapt that, or at least very quickly adapt it. So that's what we're working on. So if you look at other solutions, for example, Omniverse also uses Hydra. So those are also solutions that you could possibly, get involved with, shall we say.
Amazing. Yeah. Really, really cool to hear about your perspective on where industry trends are going as well. In talking about, I'd love to hear a bit more about what you see in terms of people using Houdini, maybe because Houdini traditionally was an effects package that people just pretty much just used for effects and maybe
Yeah.
some other things, but basically it was effects. And now it's being used more for because of Solaris essentially as a
Yeah.
layout and lighting development, being able to
Hmm.
develop in there and use it in other places and other things too. So you're seeing more people kind of migrating from some of the traditional tools that have been used towards Houdini.
It's definitely a trend, so people have been looking that they've been having situations where they can't necessarily, uh, you know, scene assembly tools are failing. The scenes are getting very big, scenes are getting very complicated, and some of the systems they've been using have not been working right. And people are looking at different ideas and poking around, and there's definitely a lot of people looking at Houdini as an idea out there. And so it's interesting, like I don't want to, I feel that in the, back, 5, 10 years ago, pretty much if you went to a visual effects studio, everyone had Maya, a license of Maya at their desk, but a handful of people had Houdini. And I have a feeling that's going to flip.
Right.
So everyone's going to be using Houdini because of its assembly tool at some point in some studios. Not everyone, but some was. It is. And that's definitely something that's an interesting trend that we're definitely seeing. The other interesting trend is on the modeling side of things. We're seeing a lot more people taking Blender way more seriously than just a goofy thing that people would do at home on their hobby time,
Yeah.
and I think that that's becoming a big thing. And I was joking, I was talking with my friend Chris Blythe, and he says, if you told me 10 years ago that the number one trending programs in visual effects are Houdini and Blender, I would have laughed at you. So,
That's right.
but yeah, that's yeah. So
It's
anyway.
happening. Biggest Google searches and download numbers by just orders of magnitude for Blender.
Mhm.
It's crazy, and not just because it's free either, because it's actually since 2.8 become a really great tool. It actually has some better tools in it
Yeah,
than some of the paid programs.
and look who's donating to the Blender
Yeah,
organization, right? There's some big companies giving a lot of money towards the Blender Foundation. So Blender Foundation ain't it's becoming as important as the Linux Foundation in some
right.
ways. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's welcoming a whole new as a person running a school, I get to meet a lot of people who are interested in computer graphics, obviously. But
Hmm.
the really interesting thing at the moment, where I think before there's been a lot of mainly visual effects people, there's lots of new people being welcomed into this conversation, and people who have, there's always been a lot of hobbyists, but
Sure.
almost every industry now is getting interested in computer graphics in some way, whether it's for
Yeah,
simulation or visualization or whatever it is. It's there's a lot more people interested in CG now.
for sure. And I think what's also become very interesting to me is, especially with the trends in virtual production. Obviously, now there's a huge demand for people that know how to use game engines for
Mm.
those purposes, which is great that you're doing the great classes that you're doing and helping people learn that. Which I've taken your class, by the way. Everyone should know that I fully endorse this class. I think it's great, and you guys should totally get on to CG Pro and do that because it was really good to do that. So obviously, there's a demand for people to know that, and there's
Thanks,
great
Chris.
schools like yours to do that. But I think what's also interesting is the trend of the generalist is back as well, right?
Yes.
uh,
Yep.
because the generalists, if you're going to be on set, you can't be like, well, I need a lighter and a modeler and a textured artist. You need someone who can do all three of those things right away and solve those problems in 5 minutes, as opposed to waiting for that pipeline to take effect. So the
Yeah.
generalist is also a big interesting thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess again, echoing what happened in the dawn of visual effects and offline, there's they needed generalists then too, to
Yep.
people to figure this stuff out. And we're back in that same spot again. We're all on a pirate ship again, trying to figure out how this stuff works. And if you only know how to do one thing, we learned that the hard way on Lion King.
Yeah.
It, how to construct teams to be able to do this stuff. And I think there's some really, really great bits of wisdom coming through here for anyone that's listening about where the industry's going, what you should focus on, what types of roles there are, and what tools to learn. If you kind of read between the lines here, there's some great pearls of wisdom coming from Chris here. So pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, it is, this is one of the things that's interesting also working at Chaos is that, when I worked in visual effects, I was only hearing the perspective of whatever studio I was working for, right? But because I come from work at Chaos and we see a lot of different studios, I'm getting hearing directly from the people, who are responsible for their technology from many companies. So I'm hearing it from hundreds of companies as opposed to just one. And so you can see these trends, and it's funny when you go to these meetings and you hear that same thing over and over again. It's like, okay, this is not just one studio that's got some crazy idea. They're going to use Houdini to do all their scene assembly. This is a repeated pattern that's happening, right? Or something that's going on. So I think that's kind of fascinating. And I think what's interesting about Houdini, because listen, there have been other tools, and there still are other tools that are out there that do this kind of stuff, right? So there's, Katana and Gaffer were basically solutions that were made around this, and those are great ones. But I think something that Houdini decided to do that was different is like we're going to build this from the ground up with the whole Solaris and all this stuff going on. And I know Katana also probably does something similar, but somehow Houdini's got some people's attention right now, and I think it's very interesting.
They've been very smart about their
Yeah,
approach to it, I think, because they've made it a first-class citizen in Houdini. It's not translating it into, it's not working in Houdini native geo and then translating it. It's actually working in UST, and even Pixar
yeah,
are using it for that because it's become better than some of their own tools that they've written.
yep.
Adding proceduralism to it is it's just such a natural marriage.
Yeah, I think it's a really smart move. So we'll see. I mean, I spoke to Judith Crow about it recently, so that was pretty cool and sort of understanding. I was like, listen, it's a cool thing, and I think the thing about USD is right now it feels very much based for the visual effects market, but there's going to be a huge demand for CG in the future and in all areas. And USD could possibly be the HTML or HTML5 of CG, right? So
Right?
the metaverse will be built on USD. Let's just put it that way, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think it's definitely worth learning. It's a little complex in the ground level, but I think
Sure.
jumping through using Houdini is a great way to get to know it because actually their documentation for USD is fantastic. It really is a great way to learn USD.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I
somebody,
think it's going to become transparent after a while. Like you don't need to learn how to use HTML5 to use the internet, right? But
yeah,
you use it
that's right.
every day, and I think USD is going to be the same way, right? People are going to buy assets, and on the internet, and I still believe that Web3 is going to be a big deal at some point, and people are going to sort of continue to buy avatars and NFTs and different assets, and those things are all going to people don't want proprietary systems anymore. I think they want systems that are universal. And I think proprietary file formats are not necessarily, well, this is my opinion. I think they're just going out of fashion. So I think that's going to be nice when things like USD come along. And listen, they've been formats that have been out there that are supposed to be, Meta SL and all these other weird things that came out. And they didn't know was work. So hopefully we'll find other ones to solve those other gaps, like the Material X one. And if they play nice and everyone can use them, where it doesn't favor any specific route that puts another product at handicaps another product, then that would be good, because that's really the key, right? Everyone needs to benefit from a universal format, and it shouldn't favor a specific group of things.
Right.
Which, by the way, was why a lot of people were skeptical about USD, because it's developed by Pixar. Pixar makes RenderMan. So if it only serves RenderMan's purpose, then it's not going to be a good universal format.
Yeah,
But it's not. And right now, a lot of people are taking advantage, and it's good. And I'm glad it's still in a good direction right now.
it seems like it's a well-defined thing at a base level, and I think that it's emerging as a leader because of that. Somebody else asked a question in here saying that they're starting off with Houdini and saying, is it better to use the General Edition or the UE plugin instead? I got
The UE plugin, is that
yeah, I
the
guess engine.
Houdini
They probably mean Houdini
Houdini
engine.
engine? I
Yeah,
mean, I would just start with Houdini.
yeah,
Because
sure.
Houdini engine is really just taking something you did in Houdini and making a little plugin out of it. That's right.
Essentially, yeah, and it kind of
Right.
presents a subset of what Houdini can do. So if you want to really learn what Houdini can do, learn it in Houdini, and then it's much easier to go the other way.
Yeah, because I mean, you can write tons of different Houdini engines that you load with the Houdini engine. So it's not all of Houdini; it's just a subset of it. I would start with Houdini in a
Yeah,
sense. I don't. Do they have an educational version? They must have. Yes,
yeah,
they do.
yeah. The Apprentice,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's free. Yeah,
Apprentice is free. Yeah, go ahead and
yeah,
start with that. It's
and
gonna.
it's just they. Sorry, go ahead.
It's just keep in mind it's different than other packages. So it's going to be a
It
little
is.
bit of a little bit of a mind adjustment that you have to make when you start off.
We actually have another, not to promote too much, but we have a class in Houdini that's really focused at generalism, and that's going to be coming up
Oh, perfect.
in the near future. Um, but yeah, it's really focused on that, because there's a new conversation to be had around that. It's not effects, there's a little bit of effects in it, but
Yeah.
there's this new breed of people that want to use Houdini, and because Houdini's been such a, as you said, it's a beast. It's tricky to learn. They're trying also on the software side to wrap it in tools that are more user friendly and make the user experience less kind of like programming, but which is happening for sure. It's still a little tricky to learn, but yeah, it's becoming so powerful now that it's, in my opinion, it's so worth learning. And I think some of the things you've said today have really echoed the time that we're in, favoring generalists, the fact that Houdini can empower a generalist to basically do the work of 10 people in a traditional pipeline in some ways.
Yeah.
And
I think
yeah,
the one place where you're still going to see people doing things outside of Houdini are modeling, right? Because
yes,
modeling and,
yeah,
right? Modeling in Houdini is not obvious.
yeah,
And so we mentioned Blender is a big solution there, but I think, other things are going on. And then actual animation and rigging. I think that some of the animation and rigging tools are still going to very much be in the Maya camp for a little bit.
yeah.
And that's fine, because then you can just bring in the USDs of your animation into Solaris, and then it'll work that way. So I still think that there's going to be, those things that are definitely happening. But in terms of assembly, I think that's going to be interesting to see those solutions happen there.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially not as good at doing destructive type work, like modeling and animation and those kinds of things that are
Right.
building and wiping out previous steps. It's very good at doing procedural things. But actually,
Sure.
the rigging, I mean, animation's a pretty destructive process, but rigging in most studios is procedurally driven. It's not in general built by hand. It's built by procedural tools that
Sure. Of course.
compile rigs. And Houdini's getting actually really good with Kine effects, and some of the new stuff there is actually
Okay.
getting really good at procedurally rigging and empowering people in a very, very Houdini way, like it's using geometry for bones instead of the way that it used to
Um,
do it. It's actually using points and geometry as the joints.
that's the
So then
joints.
all of the deformers and nodes from the geometry context are available in the rigging context by default
Interesting.
by doing that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
totally crazy concept, but it works really well. And yeah, starting to that's that part of it. I think the animation side of it still, yeah, not as great for sure, but
Well,
rigging,
also it's interesting, like it's not always the case, but when you look at in the VFX world, animators were always the weird ones. They were the least traditional people in the visual effects team, right? They I've known animators who could barely use their email, right? Like that, and so they they were very good at finding an emotion, like that, it's like acting, right? So if a good animator can really get the timing and this and that, and so they were dependent on a very technical person doing a really good rig that could give the animator the tools that they needed to do it, and then kind of go from there. So animators, I think, are still not necessarily are going to be special people, and they should be.
I agree. I've always thought I was going to become an animator and realized how many years that it took to become a really good animator. And
Yeah,
it wasn't eventually the thing that I wanted to specialize in, because you kind of do have to specialize in animation
yeah,
still to
yeah,
get good
for
at it
sure.
anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, um, yeah, it's been a total pleasure having you on, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh,
It's
thank
been
you.
a Yeah,
Thank you.
we could
Hey,
probably do it a whole other hour. I wanted to,
can I plug my my other podcasts on your
yeah,
show?
I wanted to ask you actually as we close, that anything you want to share with people. I know we
Sure.
have a CG Garage, which is an amazing podcast. You kind enough to have us on, and I would thoroughly recommend anyone who doesn't know it, like of the one or two people in the world that might not know it already, to go check
Right.
out that podcast for sure.
Yeah,
But yeah,
CG Garage has been
please.
around almost 8 years, so it's been quite a ride. This year we'll probably hit our 400th episode, which is pretty cool. And that's something, it's not dissimilar from the kind of stuff we're doing here. I've been doing it for a while, and it's been a lot of fun. I don't do it live, which I'm very jealous of. I love this live, seeing all these questions come up. Sorry, I didn't get to answer all of your questions, but it's kind of cool that that's happening. And then I also spun off another podcast out of G Garage, which is me and Dan Thron and Eric Sheely are very, very passionate about movies. And that one is called Martini Giant. And Martini Giant comes out every 2 weeks. You can check it out, martinigiant.com. But also, we generally do a show on Twitch every Saturday, and the Saturday shows. By the way, you should be prepared if you're on Martini Giant. They're 3-hour episodes because we just get very verbose about movies. But Saturday, if we don't do an actual podcast, we do a watch party, which is a lot of fun, and people participate in a watch party. So it's something that you should totally check out. So that's martinigiant.com for that one, and of course, just look up CG Garage. It'll come up pretty quickly on Google search, and you'll find that one. And that's been around for a while.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And again, thanks for having us on as well. It was tons of fun when this was
Yeah.
flipped in the other direction.
Yeah, you should listen to Jackie and Ed's story and come on to, to the thing. So it'd be really cool.
And anything else that you want to mention? Anything else that people can follow you on, or websites or social? Or...
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have. I mean, I have a Twitter. I'm at Red Eye Tales on Twitter, which is REDEYETETALES. And also, let's see, what else can you do? I don't know. I go to events every now and then, or I'm also helping out on the real time conference. I do some stuff there for them, which is fun.
Oh, cool.
And so yeah, so there's a bunch of things that I'm involved with. But yeah, just totally check it out.
Awesome. And the other projects you mentioned,
Oh
Voltaku
yes,
and
Voltaku. So yes, absolutely. Sorry, Voltaku Studio is also pretty cool. They're doing the great stuff. They're working on a project called Kiltopia, and you should check out Kiltopia. It's and they're doing other stuff as well. They're doing some NFT works and et cetera. And that's with Charles and Sally. And I've been working with them for quite a while to do some of the stuff at Voltaku. So totally look at that project as well, and see what's going on if you're curious about their goals in terms of what the studio of the future looks like. And definitely trying to help them out with some of the cool stuff they're doing over at Chaos on that.
cool. And obviously Chaos Group, that you
Yep,
can check
which
them
is
out.
not just chaos.com. We got rid of the group.
Oh wow,
Believe it or
that's
not.
cool.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah, that was
domain name.
expensive domain
I was
purchase.
going to say, I bet it was. Anything less than 5 letters is
Well, yeah,
automatically a
it's a
lot.
big deal. Chaos. Well, the thing is now, Chaos is actually quite big because we've actually merged with several other companies in the last few months. There's this big thing that happened. Chaos is now over 750 people, believe it or not.
Wow.
And it's, so Chaos merged with a company called Enscape, and then we acquired another company called Celindo. And most of that stuff is on the ArcViz side, but there's definitely, I would say, follow what's going on at Chaos over the next couple of years, because you're going to see a company that's going to be very, very ambitious. Let's just put it that way. So yeah, it's
Very
going to be
cool.
interesting. Yeah.
I will definitely, have been for years, but I will continue to. And I love following companies that are really innovative. I think the ones that you've mentioned so far today are the ones that are pushing through and sustaining and growing and
Mhm.
getting everyone's attention. Those ones that really double down on innovation and growth. And yeah, it's really exciting time.
Yeah, for
And
sure. For sure.
yeah, I just again thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and wisdom. And yeah, it's been a total pleasure having you on.
All right. Thank you so much, Ed. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks. I hope we get to do it again. And thanks also to all our listeners out there. Thanks for tuning in today. If you heard it live, and you can also catch the replay on all the usual podcast channels. If you're interested in what we do, we're at becomecgpro.com, and we will be back again in a couple of weeks for another episode. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.